to 300 a day. I can't even remember of where we are in terms of South African lockdown, but delighted to welcome you to our first webinar of the year. We've had the African Investment Summit online last year in partnership with the DIT, but it's great to be driving this agenda and to be joined by Sanan Mirzoyev, who is the anti-corruption advisor for Southern Africa for our UK government's Prosperity Fund. Welcome, Sanan. Before I introduce Sanan in detail and go through the agenda, I really want you all to reflect, and using the chat, tell us what your immediate reactions are and thoughts are when you hear the word procurement. What are your thoughts and feelings? Please put those into the chat. So today we're going to be talking about how procurement works in South Africa, after which we're going to take some questions of procurement. My colleague Cecilia, you'll see on screen, she's going to be feeding in the Q&A. Thank you, Terence, for that lively start. I'm sure we'll get to, we'll talk to you throughout this session. But Sanan's going to take us through a series of presentations, and we're going to have opportunities for polls and for questions, which Cecilia will feed in. This is being recorded, and please do participate using the reaction buttons as we go through, and we'll make the recording available at the end of the session. So we're going to talk about procurement, and then we're going to take some questions. Then Sanan is going to talk a little bit more about corruption, which I'm sure Terence will be pleased that we're going to cover that. And then we'll take some questions again. But I suppose as a means of an icebreaker, it's interesting to see what people's thoughts are in terms of what's coming up. I saw procurement flash up. Anything else there, Cecilia, we're seeing coming in on procurement?
I'm afraid to say I'm not very surprised. It seems quite a cynical bunch or disillusioned. Opportunity to some, bucks on the side for some people, corruption, people saying it must be a fair process, a fertile ground for fraud and corruption. And that's the general trend, I'm afraid to say. But I think hopefully today we're going to hope to also bring you some tools and hopefully some positive news as well. So that people might come away with a slightly more positive attitude, but even if that is just because we know a bit more how to navigate things.
Yeah, thanks. And you can see Renee there saying, one of our board directors, saying a lack of transparency. So Sanan is actually going to talk about some of the impactful ways the UK is partnering with state institutions such as National Treasury, the Department for Public Service and Administration, to improve corruption safeguards in procurement. And we will have plenty of opportunity for questions. And I do encourage interactivity throughout this process. Before I hand over to Sanan, I'd like to conduct a poll, our first poll. Ema, if you could set that up for us. And essentially, what the poll's asking us is, it should just come up now on your screen. How would you rate your comfort level in accessing opportunities via public procurement processes? Do you understand the processes and how to access the opportunities? Are you interested to explore the opportunities but are uncertain, confused? You don't see public procurement as a relevant opportunity for your business or other? And if you want to put in the chat to explain what the other is, we can certainly come back to that. But it'd be great to kind of sense check where we are as an audience before we hand over to Sanan. So we'll just wait for those poll results to come through. I can anticipate what the responses might be, but let's see where we are. Can we bring those up, Ema? So 29% of you understand the process and how to access the opportunities, but 43%, nearly half, are interested to explore but have some elements of uncertainty and confusion. And then a quarter is essentially saying you don't see any relevant opportunities for you. With 3%, we can explore another. So actually not so bad in that. At nearly a third are understanding, but nearly half, there's some element of confusion. So Sanan, perhaps it's a great opportunity to thank you for joining us this morning and to hand over to you to kind of perhaps help us see the wood for the trees.
Great, thanks very much, Leon, and really grateful for the opportunity to present here to such a lively and wide audience. So I'm just going to share my screen before I get started. So you can just confirm that you can all see that.
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, so I think very interesting poll to get things started, and I think it also explains the challenge in terms of trying to see how we pitch this in the most effective way. I think when we originally had this conversation with the British Chamber, the sense was that we'd want to have a basic overview and introduction, but I can see just from the attendees on the call that there's clearly a much wider audience that has a lot of interest in this. So it's been great to see, and I must apologize for the specialists in the room who might be hearing information that is quite common knowledge to them. But hopefully we'll be able to cover the details and also the wider picture over the course of this call, although we don't have as much time as one might need in order to do that effectively. But yes, for starters, I just want to introduce myself and the program that we're running from the UK government in South Africa. So I think, Leon, you already did the basic introduction, but to further to that, I am the anti-corruption advisor for Southern Africa under the UK government's Prosperity Fund program. What that is, it is a global program, and it's a fund, and it's separated into various different programs ranging from better health through to trade, through to business environment, and anti-corruption is one of the components of the Prosperity Fund. And yeah, in that sense, I'm responsible for program activities in the region. And so I will be talking about, some of the work that we've been doing more widely in the anti-corruption section. But for this first section, I'm going to focus on procurement, which is also a very strong component of our bilateral work with South Africa. So, so with that in mind, I'll get going. So procurement in South Africa, I think we'll start with an overview and a context. It's significant amounts of money are spent on it. Over 800 billion rand a year, as Treasury has reported, is spent through government procurement. And I think obviously the very simple explanation of what procurement is, it's obviously the process that government has to follow when it acquires any goods and services from the private sector. There's legal frameworks in place that have to be complied with, and there's a process that has to be followed in order to award tender contracts to prospective suppliers of goods or services. So a feature of procurement in South Africa is that it is highly decentralized. There's over 719 different procuring entities that exist in South Africa. And the way that that's subdivided is you obviously have a National Treasury that plays a central role in allocating budgets to various provincial treasuries, who then further allocate budgets to local government departments. And through that, then each different department, each different entity will have its own procuring authority and an accounting officer. And the individual who is designated as the accounting officer will differ depending on which level of government you're looking at. But the point is that it's highly decentralized. And by virtue of that, it's highly fragmented as well. And so it becomes quite challenging when you start talking about things like procurement reform to identify exactly where do you change things, how do you have the most impactful intervention, because it is so highly decentralized. So another point that maybe is just a sort of interesting note to observe is, according to Corruption Watch's annual reports, that the three sectors that are seen or perceived to be most corrupt in the country are education, police, and health. Obviously, when it comes to procurement specifically, I think that can range more widely, but it's very difficult to get accurate assessments of what the exact scale of that is. And that's not just a South Africa challenge, that's a global challenge. Anywhere you go, it's equally difficult to identify the proper scale of corruption in procurement. So looking at South African procurement specifically, I'd like to touch on things like empowerment policy, local content, and the historical context of South Africa. This, again, might be very common knowledge, and I know we have a lot of experts on the call and companies that have quite a large presence in South Africa. But I think for the sake of those colleagues who are joining from abroad, just to explain sort of the policies that underpin South African procurement. So the transformation policy in South Africa This was created as a post-apartheid response, first with Black economic empowerment, and then with BBBE, broad-based Black economic empowerment. And what the underpinning for that was is that there was a need to transform society. There was a need for redistribution following the effects of apartheid. And so as a result of that, there's a requirement that there needs to be Black ownership or representation within a business to a certain degree. Companies are issued a certificate, a BBBE compliance certificate, and depending on their level, that can affect their score. And the scoring is part of the process in awarding procurement contracts, or rather tenders. And so in that sense, that is a common feature there. So there would either need to be ownership within the business. If it's an overseas business in South Africa, it would have a domestic presence, and within that structure, it would have to have Black ownership or control. And if it is, obviously, depending on what the scale of that is, will depend on the level of award that's given. But I'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a moment. So the legal framework for procurement in South Africa, there's quite a few bits of legislation that apply to it. You get the Municipal Finance Management Act, and that applies to all your local government entities. You get the Public Finance Management Act, which is applicable to all provincial and national entities. And then you get the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, which applies to all. Now, there's more legislation that can touch on certain sections and provisions, but this is the sort of the main sources of information for the legal framework for procurement. So when it comes to state-owned entities, which is a very commonly brought up topic and something we'll touch on more later in the call, they are included into the PFMA and the MFMA by virtue of a schedule. So there's no actual definition for state-owned entities. They are specifically listed as part of that legislation. So there is a requirement for compliance, but we will touch on some of the big flaws or at least challenges that we've seen around state-owned entity regulation through the work that we've been doing with South African government. So another key development is the Public Procurement Bill. And so the idea behind this bill is that it is meant to consolidate all your various strands, all your PFMAs and MFMAs into a single consolidated piece of legislation that should be able to offer all the insights that's needed to operate in South African procurement. This bill has been around for quite a long time. In fact, it was commonly known to have been shelved under the previous administration, but has now come back to light. And we do feel that it's going to take quite a while before it sees the light of day. The main reason for that is following the public comment phase where Parliament made the bill open to commentary. We have sources that have indicated that over 4,500 comments were received. And so by time all of that is processed and some of the challenges are addressed, then we suspect it will be quite a long time. So I've pointed out that it's aimed at consolidating your various bits of procurement legislation. Another feature of it is that it creates a single procurement regulatory authority in South Africa. So currently you get the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, but that was established without the formal sort of legislative framework around it. So this would in effect give that regulator more teeth, but it would in all likelihood still reflect what the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer looks like. So looking at the strengths and weaknesses, and this is purely a subjective assessment based on our experience, but the strengths is obviously there is always a need for consolidation of procurement work, the procurement framework. I think as it currently stands, even lawyers have to run through hoops in order to understand all the details and nuances of how the legislation applies. Whereas a single piece of legislation might make it easier from a compliance perspective for businesses as well. Obviously, the creation of a regulator, formal central authority should always be welcomed. One of the big challenges that we see around transparency and accountability in procurement is the fact that it is so fragmented. It is so, the decentralization or decentralized nature of it makes it quite challenging to track exactly what is happening at what time. when we look at the weaknesses in terms of the procurement bill, the question is whether it goes far enough in consolidating laws. And I'll touch on, going back to my point on state-owned entities, I'll touch on why we feel this way later on in the presentation. Another weakness is potentially around transparency. Quite a wide range of civil society actors in South Africa have raised this as a concern around the fact that information can be accessed under certain circumscribed or prescribed instances. But the reality is that there's a global movement right now, particularly being driven by Open Contracting Partnership, who I believe one of their representatives might be on the call now. But there's no need to hide any commercially sensitive information. There was always this sense that somehow you need to protect commercial information, and that's often what makes government quite reticent to release it. On top of that, there's also the point around protection of personal information. So in South Africa, the PAPIA Act, and that raises certain concerns, but there are ways to work around that, and there are ways in which to make data quite freely available. And so it seems like there's a bit of a blanket attempt to regulate under what circumstances you can access procurement data. And, you know, in an ideal circumstance, that would be more freely available. The next point is ICT. So Section 15 of the proposed bill talks about the potential of or that government departments are encouraged or will be compelled to use ICT for procurement. The challenge with that is that it's too broad and it's too vague. I think currently what we've seen in South Africa is that there's a whole range of entities that do have procurement opportunities published on their pages, but the lack of consolidation, the lack of centrality around that makes it very difficult for any ICT solution to actually address some of the fundamental problems that we see in procurement. And I think a lot of the colleagues on the call alluded to that in the chat box. Looking at state-owned entities, again, I won't touch on that now. I'll touch on that on the anti-corruption component. And then another one is around sanctions. I think we got a question around Section 39(1)(h) of the proposed procurement bill. And I knew that question came from a lawyer. But I think the question around that was the regulator may set aside a tender award in the event that there's evidence of fraud or collusion or corruption, etc. And the question was whether that may should be must rather. So that is a very lawyerly question, and I think I'd give the lawyer answer to that, which would be it depends. The question around evidence is, do you want a government regulator to have to effectively always cancel whenever there's any kind of evidence without an evaluation of the type of evidence? So, you know, for instance, hearsay or whatever the case may be, or weak evidence, then should they be compelled to set aside a contract? And in the event that that does happen, it might be quite disruptive to service delivery in the sense that, you know, unhappy competitors may raise evidence, weak evidence, however it's defined, and that might then result in a tender award being set aside, which, you know, we have to factor in the disruption that can have on service delivery as well. So it's an interesting question, but I think the fact that there is the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act in South Africa, the legal framework is there. But the challenges are widespread. You know, I know that it's common to say that the lawyer will say that the problem is legal, the economist will say that the problem is economic, and the doctor will say that the problem is medical. But in this case, I think some of the big challenges we see is not just a legal framework issue. It's actually, you know, far wider than that, and we'll touch on that later in the presentation. All right, so looking at the types of procurement that you get in South Africa, the first thing that I'll do, and to anyone that is interested or who wants to learn more about how procurement works in South Africa, is to use this tool over here, the Vulekamali Procurement Guide. I'm going to click on it, and hopefully you can all see. But this was created by Imali Yetu, which is a coalition of civil society, and they were working in partnership with National Treasury. And they created this portal here, which basically explains in a very simplified way what what the steps of procurement are. There's FAQs here. And yeah, would strongly recommend having a look around here, having a browse around here if any of you are involved in the supply chain aspect of your businesses, because this will really explain, you know, how the legal framework applies. And I think it's a really easily accessible, you know, explanatory guide. So that link is there, but if you just type Vulekamali procurement into Google, you should be able to access this page as well. So looking at the types of procurement that you get in South Africa, you get what's called RFIs, or request for information, RFQs, request for quotations, or RFPs, request for procurement. And they're all dictated through thresholds. So RFIs, that is typically a process that's available to government where they need to understand what the specification is. So say, for instance, you need to build, well, let me not say build, because infrastructure is quite a strongly regulated sector. But, you know, say, for instance, you need to procure a type of medicine. But in terms of, you know, best practice and what is the best type of medication to treat a certain disease, perhaps government might not be in a position to answer that. And so they would put out a request for information, basically inviting suppliers to come and advise them on how to design the ultimate procurement. The impact of participating in the request for information is obviously it's considerably less work. And the participant then is precluded from participating in the actual procurement at a later stage, so the RFP or the RFQ, depending on what the threshold is. Then looking at RFQs, it's a far simpler process in procurement. It's for any procurement that's less than 500,000 Rand or less than 200,000 Rand when we're considering municipalities. And that effectively invites bidders to submit a quote. And it's often determined then on what the cheapest price is. And so a formal, fully structured proposal isn't required for RFQs. And, you know, so that tends to be a much quicker process. And finally, you get RFPs. So that's when it's over 500,000 Rand for national and provincial government and over 200,000 Rand for municipalities. And in that case, a full proposal is required. We'll go through what that entails in a moment. But yeah, the point is that is quite more resource intensive for companies that are interested in bidding for those sorts of opportunities. In terms of the process that's followed on government's end, you get 3 stages effectively. According to the PFMA, you get the bid specification committee or the BSC stage, you get the bid evaluation committee or the BEC stage, and then you get the BAC committee, which is, or the BAC or the bid adjudication committee. And so what each of these stages involve is the BSC is the point at which government needs to define a spec or a requirement. So when they know that they need to go to market to procure, you know, let's say they need accounting services. This is at the point at which they'll sit down, they'll identify what the need is. They'll often be in alignment to a strategy. So there might be a national strategy document, a departmental level strategy document, and they'll plan their budgets forward around these sorts of procurements that they'll have to do. So they'll make the technical requirements and determine all the prerequisites before the tender is published. Going back to my point around RFIs, if that request for information process is going to take place, it will normally take place in this sort of specification stage in order to help define the specification. Then you get the bid evaluation committee. So this is after a tender has been published, and I'll tell you about how and where they're published in a moment. It scores bidders according to technical specifications, and will look at, okay, well, in principle, they're meant to look at, you know, your triple BE score, price and functionality. Typically what ends up happening is functionality is assessed in a very formalistic way. So it will be, you know, do you have this many years of experience? Do you have this certificate? Do you have this license to do X, Y, and Z? And once you've passed that, you've effectively met the functionality criteria. And then the scoring really then turns on pricing and triple BE score. And for that, you then look at the triple PFA Act that I'd mentioned earlier, the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, where if there's certain thresholds in play, if it's a contract over 50 million, then they may use the 90-10 principle, where you score 90% on functionality and price, which in practice would be price, and then 10% would be on BEE score, or triple BE score. If it's between 30 million and 50 million, then there's the 80-20 preference rule, where 20% of the score can be allocated to triple BE, and 80% would be allocated to price and functionality, or in practice, you know, once you've ticked the functionality boxes, you would just be assessed on price. One of the big challenges that we've seen there, particularly for infrastructure or construction sector companies, has been the local content requirement, because it's not clearly defined. While it is included in the triple PFA, it's not clearly defined as to what that means. Is it South Africa wide? Is it geographically situated around the area where the work is taking place? And so the lack of definition around there often gives government or the particular department that's doing the procurement a little bit of a discretion, or very wide discretion actually, to determine what local content would mean in that context. So there's definitely a need for clarification around what the meaning of local content is. But that is one of the things that we've seen as well in our work. So going to the point of how do you access opportunities in South Africa? So we're operating here from a perspective of a company that's coming into South Africa from outside, not necessarily a company that has established its own internal compliance. So I see there's some UK originated companies that have a very strong South African presence that have already gone very far in terms of their triple B compliance. So this would definitely not be applicable to those colleagues on the call. But this is just an overview of how that might work. So in terms of local partnerships, the big point is, it is possible for consortium to be established or for bids to be joint with different suppliers, and that would then allow a foreign company then to potentially then comply with triple BE requirements. And with that, it's very important whenever there's any sort of business development partnership, or for instance, a contract that's being outsourced by a company that has won a contract from government, that UK companies do their due diligence. The main reason for that is because of the UK Bribery Act. This piece of legislation in the UK also criminalizes any activities by UK companies outside of the UK. So in that sense, if it is found that there was some sort of nefarious activity or corruption that took place through that local partnership that the UK company is now partnered with, they would be criminally liable. The UK company would be criminally liable in the UK. And in that sense, it's very important to pay very close attention to due diligence and make sure that everything is above board before entering into a business partnership. I think the track record tends to speak to that, and obviously shelf companies are also something that need to factor in under the due diligence consideration, because those can often be misleading as to their track record and their experience. So then going on your own, I wanted to talk quickly, I see I need to actually move through the time we have, but to talk through registering your business, registering as a supplier, and finding tender opportunities in South Africa. So if you're coming into South Africa as a foreign business and you don't have a presence here yet, government, the Companies and Intellectual Properties Commission has created the Biz Portal. Now, this Biz Portal was actually created in consortium with the South African banking sector, which in turn was supported by the IFC, which in turn was supported by our Global Business Environment Program. So in that sense, we have that link in creating this Biz Portal, and it's really allowed registration of business to go down significantly. So before, one would make use of service providers, perhaps acquire a shelf company or whatever the case may be, but now Biz Portal makes that a lot easier. So I'll quickly take you to that site, but now it's been digitized. So before, where registering a company in South Africa could take up to well, just over a month, now it takes just over a week. And so, through this process, it will guide you through, the company registration itself, which can be done online, as well as then tax registration, domain name registration, triple BE certificates. So these are things that you would typically need in order to register your South African business. Perhaps not domain names, but the rest of them would definitely be relevant. All right, so let me just go back to the presentation. So once you've registered your business in South Africa, now you've established a South African presence. If you were interested in bidding for South African procurement, you would need to make use of the Central Supply Database. So when you access the Central Supply Database, what this is, it's got over 800,000 registered suppliers on it, and it's a prerequisite for most tender applications. So when you see tender opportunities, they will require your Central Supply Database registration number to confirm that you are a supplier there. The whole idea behind the Central Supply Database was that it was to reduce paperwork for companies, because once you've got all your information registered on the CSD, then you wouldn't need to resubmit it for every tender. Although what we've seen in practice, and this goes back to that challenge of decentralization or fragmentation, what tends to happen is that some government departments might require you to submit the same documentation again, even though you already have your registration on the CSD. So it's a bit of a challenge, and it's obviously something that hopefully something like a procurement regulator could help to resolve, to ensure that processes are properly streamlined. But yeah, the point is that you go onto the central supply database, and from there you can just follow the steps. It's got this very helpful graphic here that will show you how to do it. And then from there, you are now registered as a South African government supplier of goods or services. One thing that we will say is that you should always watch out for unsolicited requests for quotations. It has been reported that some individuals in the supply chain may reach out because they have access to all the suppliers' contact information. So they might reach out and say, hey, come and give us a quotation for this and give an award, and then the service or the goods are delivered, and then there's actually no official contract in government for that. So it was a scam or a fraud. So in that sense, one must keep their wits about them, and watch out for those RFQs, and often confirming with the actual entity itself around the status of the procurement might help to avoid that from happening. So then going to the point of finding tender opportunities, you would go to the e-tender portal. So this is something that was created, and look, its functionality is questionable in terms of its end-to-end process. It advertises tenders, it's got publication functionality, but compliance has also proved challenging. So National Treasury's OCPO issued a circular to all procurement entities saying that they must publish their tenders over a certain threshold on the e-tender system. But in practice, we see that publication is all right, but when it comes to all the following information that you need for procurement, like tracking the contract performance, etc., that data is nowhere to be found. So compliance is a massive challenge when it comes to this portal. That said, still a good source to see tenders that are being published. So you can break down your categories here. So say, for instance, you want to look at legal. I see there are quite a lot of law firms on the call, so I'm going to go legal and accounting activities, and we'll leave it open to say any province, any department. And so you'll see here then there's request for a panel of attorneys, panel of lawyers, establishment of a panel. And so you can click here, and then through that, you can access the tender documents as well. Unfortunately, they're all in PDF, which means that when it comes to things like advanced data analytics, these are relatively inaccessible. But that said, as if you manually go through the process, you can certainly find tender opportunities here. I've also got links here to national and provincial and municipal departments, which will have their own distinct tender portals. So you can look out there as well to see opportunities within particular geographic areas, and those get published on those platforms too. So yeah, I'm going to stop there just because of time. So I'll hand back to you, Leon, if there are any questions. Thanks.
Sanan, thank you very much for that whistle-stop tour around the world of procurement in South Africa, comprehensive overview. I see there's some rich questions in our comments, which Cecilia will come to shortly. But before we do that, we thought we'd have another poll. And essentially, we're exploring what you feel is the biggest challenge for South African procurement. Is it policy uncertainty, the red tape bureaucracy? Is it corruption, collusion, and fraud? Is it a lack of transparency around government procurement? Or is it around receiving timeliest payments from government, particularly for small enterprises and SMEs? Be really interested to see what the audience's perceptions are before we move into the questions. And Sanan, while we're waiting for those results, did you say education and healthcare were some of the worst sectors for corruption?
Yeah. So police, education, and health have been flagged by Corruption Watch as being the most corrupt sectors in South Africa.
That's quite fascinating, particularly in this time of COVID. And I'm sure we'll talk to perhaps some of the PPE corruption, tenders, alleged corruption as we move on. How are those results looking, Yima? So policy uncertainty and red tape are a challenge according to 24%, but just over half, 53%, it really is corruption, collusion, and fraud. And then 11% a lack of transparency and getting paid on time. That's really interesting. Cecilia, perhaps I can hand over to you and you can share some of the questions.
Yeah, I think we've asked our audience to please submit questions before the webinar today. So a few of you had some comments and some worries and some questions that I'll run through, and also just some of my own thoughts. I think a lot of the issues are around a decentralized and fragmented system, as you pointed out, Sanan. And I think the whole thing is people are feeling what Regina Malloy was also saying, is that even if you do everything right on a system, the process is still handled unfairly. When someone is awarded something, there's very little due diligence. What can a person really do in instances like that? I also found the business portal, the Vuleka Mali procurement guide, very handy. I am wondering, and this is, I don't have the experience here, possibly someone like Terence might also be able to comment here, but what I found with these portals, particularly I had an experience when I tried to renew a passport with the online system, the minute that something is not an exact tick box on a system, you get stuck and you get thrown out, and very often it would not be something complicated or unusual. And I'm wondering, you know, how safeguarded is the system against that? And if you do run into problems, how good is the support? I think possibly if we can hear a bit from your side on those issues, Sanan, and then maybe I'll ask Terence if he has a few comments to add to that.
Sure. Thanks, Cecilia. I'm going to try and make sure I've tracked those questions correctly. But yeah, so you know, around the point of, you know, complying and then, you know, experiencing the frustration when processes are unfair, there are multiple channels through which complaints can be channeled. You know, the Vuleka Mali portal actually does have a list of resources there when you do feel like you've been aggrieved by a procurement award. Obviously not necessarily a great option for SMMEs due to the cost of it, but litigation is also always an option for the larger companies where they can take certain awards on review and have contracts set aside through the court process. But that said, yeah, I mean, look, the system is susceptible and there are vulnerabilities. That's unfortunately a reality that we're seeing. I think a lot of the time, and actually having had many discussions with civil society and a wide range of donors, the commonly accepted challenge is that there's a lack of professionalization within the supply chain management arena in South African government, and there needs to be a higher level of professionalization. There needs to be a certificate, a qualification, a formal qualification to be a procurement official because of all the nuances that apply. I think over and above that, it goes to the substantive part, you know, substantive contract management, not just ensuring that a contract has been awarded and the process has been followed, but the actual substance of the service or the goods that are delivered. There's a real lack of tracking around that and contract management. And so in that sense, you know, addressing those sorts of capacity challenges in government are definitely big ones, but if you can do that, then that would be a solution. Going to your point of systems, that's another challenge that we see, you know, right now with the world is moving digital, enterprise systems don't necessarily always speak to the priorities because you need to run digital systems by having staff that are permanently employed to work and maintain and run that. And what we've seen is it can happen in government, where government will go and procure a very expensive platform or portal, but will, you know, maintenance of that system will not be a continuous process. So, you know, in line with what many tech companies, global tech companies do, they build all of their services in-house. So government, we would want to see them transition to that approach as well, which is something that the UK did when it established the Government Digital Service in 2011. I hope I covered it all, but yeah, you can maybe prompt me if I haven't.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's also one comment we had before the webinar was someone asking around what protocols does the UK have to ensure or to try and safeguard against corruption that we might be able to learn from, and are our systems and our processes at this stage incorporating them? I think before then, if Terence, our procurement expert, I'm going to invite you to speak. If you might have anything to say also to our attendees on these points.
Yeah, thanks, Celia, and that was a really insightful presentation. So appreciate that. I think the lack of tracking is a massive problem, and two cases in point that come to mind immediately is the fact that we spent 90 million rand for upgrades to City Hall in Swane, and not a single bit of work was done. And I think when the new public enterprises minister came in, we realized that we're paying 30 million rand a month for fuel at SA Express, and not a single drop of fuel was delivered. So procurement is one thing, making sure that delivery actually happens is another. And from an SME perspective, it goes beyond just the procurement. I've heard of SMEs getting friendly with accounts departments to ensure that they get paid faster, because if you aren't friendly with the relevant accounts team, then they'll just drag your payment and say, we're waiting for this approval, and the red tape just is endless, really. So one of the top 3 reasons why SMEs fail is due to late payments, and the South African government has been renowned as a late payer of SMEs. And if you think about in a post-COVID world where so many SMEs have gone under, it becomes imperative for government to pay faster now to protect those jobs that SMEs are generating. So yeah, it's the whole ecosystem. It's not just the procurement. It's ensuring the delivery. It's ensuring the payment is timeous. And if you have timeous payments, then you can access funding on the back of that. It just makes access to funding so much easier, knowing that you are going to get paid, on delivery or in 15 or 30 days or that type of stuff. So that whole ecosystem needs a complete revamp and shake-up, in my opinion.
Thanks. Thank you, Terence. I'm going to quickly pose 2 more questions before we move on to the next section. What is your experience regarding the RFI process being seen as a means to get good information without reciprocity? Does it not taint the process? And then also we had Jonathan Foster-Pegley just asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on the corruption that happens in the education space specifically.
Thanks, Cecilia. Yeah, and thanks, Terence, for making some very valid points. I mean, I can completely agree with you, and that really goes to that point of contract management, which is, after procurement is published, after an award is made, the follow through, and that's really where the data is lacking currently, and that's really where, as you point out, that's where a lot of the vulnerabilities actually come into play. So it's a very well made point. I think going to the questions around experience of RFI for good information without reciprocity. So it's an interesting question, because one thing that I have found is that in South Africa, because of the paranoia around corruption in procurement, and because of the regulatory environment, it's highly formalized, the way in which government can interact with the private sector. They have to formally issue an RFI, and obviously there is good information, but there's remuneration for that as well. Perhaps not as much as the main contract itself, but just for the consultancy services effectively, there's remuneration. So in that sense, I would say that there's some reciprocity in that sense. But actually, what we see and what we've seen in the UK is most effective is actually the pre-market engagement phase of any sort of government contract is so critical in the UK. Being able to access the private sector in a sort of forum and being able to talk about what fair prices are for things, what are the latest technologies, what are the best ways to do certain things. That sort of engagement, because of the culture or perhaps the sense of paranoia and fear in procurement in South Africa, that doesn't happen unless it's through this very formalized RFI process. So, I actually think that good information should be shared with government, because ultimately government is doing work for the betterment of the public. Where there's better infrastructure, businesses can operate better on it. The idea is that there should be a more collaborative approach, which is something that would be great to see if South Africa could come up with an approach to that in its highly regulated environment. So I think that. And then elaborating on education. So corruption in education, and again, going back to that report, those three sectors, it doesn't purely apply to procurement. It applies to corruption more broadly, so that can involve bribes. And I think possibly in the education sector where we see the highest challenges in corruption is the cash for jobs debacle. South African government has a massive allocation for education of all of the sectors that it allocates its budget to annually. And yet, you know, education seems to be one of the big challenges that are facing South Africa. You know, and obviously the disparities between quality and levels of access to education, that is a massive challenge. And obviously the cash for jobs, I think, is really what underpins, you know, or at least is one of the major concerns in that area.
Okay, thank you. I think I know Steven Powell would like to talk on some risk management in the corruption space. Steven, if you don't mind, I think we're going to move on so Sanan can also get to his corruption part, after which we would love to hear from you. But at this point, Leon, if you want to continue with our agenda.
Thanks, Cecilia, and thanks everyone for those high levels of engagement. So before we move on to the corruption piece specifically, I thought it'd be interesting to run a poll assessing where we think South Africa ranks globally from a corruption perspective. So this poll is, where do you think South Africa ranks out of 189 countries in Transparency International's most recent corruption perceptions? And this is dated in 2019. So this is actually 1 to 49 being the least corrupt, 50 to 99, 100 to 149, 150 to 178. It'd be interesting to see where you believe we are currently ranked here in South Africa. So please vote. And Terence from Truzo, perhaps we can share with this audience the details of your organization, what Truzo can do in terms of tracking procurement processes from a blockchain digitization perspective.
Yeah, so thanks, Leon. So the reason behind us developing Truzo was purely to stop this pandemic of corruption that we had post-COVID. I mean, we had a pandemic of corruption for the last decade or so that needed to be solved. And, you know, having grown up in this country, it just breaks your heart to know the legacy that we come from, what we've endured, and to see what's happened in government over the last, you know, over a decade pretty much. So Truzo digitized the escrow concept and democratized that concept, where we created a platform where you can create a transaction between a buyer and a seller, where the buyer places his funds, Truzo holds the cash securely in trust, and only when there's delivery of goods or services as per the agreement and the buyer's happy, do they tick a box and we release payment. Going a step pre that, before you can transact on our platform, there's a whole compliance check that's done on the transacting parties. So we do a KYC check, we do an anti-money laundering check, we do a sanctions list check, and we verify that your ID number and the bank account associated with your ID number match each other. So, for example, you may be, you know, perfectly fine, Leon, and you know, an upward-standing member of our society, but you know, someone's using you as a front, and the money goes into their bank account. So we ensure before we take on a client that we do all of these compliance checks, and only on delivery of goods or services do we release the funds that we're holding to the service provider. In that way, the buyer is getting exactly what they're paying for. They're getting delivery of their goods or services, or and the products that they've procured. But the service provider and the seller is getting paid literally on delivery. So you're not having to wait 30, 60, or 90 days for payment either. So, you know, we act on behalf of both the buyer and the seller with regard to that. We developed the world's first escrow app that does that, so you can download the app from the app stores. And on the back of our operation in the UK and our head office in the UK, we're the only service provider in South Africa that offers a multi-currency platform, where South Africa has very strict exchange controls. We've applied to the Reserve Bank here to offer multiple currencies. They refused. Thanks to our UK operation, with no exchange controls, we can conduct transactions in multiple currencies as well. We're registered with the FSCA in South Africa and the Payment Association of South Africa as well. And we've just submitted our application to the FCA in the UK.
Now, thanks, Terence. And we've been watching your success over the last couple of years. So great to have you on board as a member. If anybody wants Terence's details, please contact us at the Chamber and we will connect you. Sanan.
Thanks, Leo.
Thanks, Terence. Cheers. Back to you, Sanan, jumping into the corruption piece.
Great, thanks, Leon. I'm going to try and fly through the section, just mindful of the time. I think I may have gotten a bit carried away in the procurement section, so hopefully we can cruise through this quick enough. But yes, so looking at anti-corruption, hopefully you can all see my screen, if you could just confirm.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So looking at anti-corruption, it's a very wide range of activity that needs to take place. You need to consider it from a law enforcement level. You need to consider it from a procurement level. Obviously, on the preventative side, how are you picking up irregularities in procurement? How are you flagging that with various regulators and entities that might have access to that information? How is that information then being relayed to law enforcement? How is law enforcement then pursuing those cases through an investigative perspective? How are they building up sufficient evidence for the National Prosecuting Authority to then take the matter to court? And how is that matter being finalized in court? So it's really so many stages involved in the sort of anti-corruption initiative. And so we have to look at a lot of these aspects as well in order to see how we can tackle it most impactfully. Something worth flagging is that fixing corruption is not an overnight process. I think very interesting coming out of the poll. I don't know if I heard the results, but South Africa actually ranks 70 in the 2019 Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. So it ranks 70 out of 180 countries. And actually this morning they released the 2020 result, and South Africa is actually ranked 69 out of 180 countries. So it just goes to show, and looking at the poll, clearly the perception is quite different. In fact, only 8% of the participants felt that South Africa is in the bracket which it actually is. So in that sense, there is something to flag here, that corruption is a global problem. It's not a South Africa problem. You see it everywhere in the world. The country that came number one for many years, it comes number one is Denmark, and just 2-3 short years ago, it was rocked by one of the biggest private sector scandals through the 200 billion euro Danske Bank scandal, where money was being laundered through its Estonia branch. So we see that corruption is a problem that affects the whole world. But going to how the work is taking place in South Africa, we have global, regional, and bilateral activities and initiatives which we support as the UK government. In terms of the procurement initiatives, we work with Government Digital Service on what's called the Global Digital Marketplace, transforming procurement systems using digital technology, leveraging the UK's experience of establishing its own end-to-end digital procurement system for ICT procurement. And so when I say end-to-end, it goes beyond just publication. It goes to submission of tenders, so registration, publication of the tender, submission of tenders, evaluation of bids, actual award notification. That entire end-to-end cycle has been digitized through the UK's digital marketplace, which it uses internally. So the global digital marketplace is aimed at sharing those experiences with partner governments, and South Africa is one of the recipients of that support. Looking at other law enforcement support that we provide, we've got a designated liaison officers based in South Africa from Crown Prosecution Services, which is like the UK's National Prosecuting Authority, the National Crime Agency, which is like it's the UK's equivalent to potentially the Hawks or the DPCI or Crime Intelligence under SAPS, and then HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, so that would be the equivalent of the South African Revenue Service. So we have liaison officers from all of those UK law enforcement departments present in the country and ready to support South African law enforcement when tracking funds overseas. Obviously, London being one of the global financial centers, there's a need for that sort of responsiveness. Then we have a program that we're supporting, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which is providing policy support in the region to implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, of which South Africa is a signatory. So they have a regional program there where they're looking at certain policy levers like whistleblower protection, detection of anti-corruption or detection of corruption in procurement, interagency cooperation, because we know that with corruption, to prove it is incredibly challenging because building the evidence is very hard. In the UK Serious Fraud Office, which is basically what the Hawks' predecessor, the Scorpions, was modeled on the UK Serious Fraud Office. And it can take up to 10 years to resolve a case because of the complexity of building that evidence, of doing the forensic investigation and having the sort of evidence that you need to prove your case in court. So yeah, they provide support around the interagency cooperation aspect. There's also an ENSA network, which performs the same function in the Southern African region. And then we also have the International Anti-Corruption Coordination Center, which is a pre-mutual legal assistance request intelligence sharing network, which connects all your major intelligence agencies across the Five Eyes, and as well as other financial centers. So that's the UK, UK's National Crime Agency, the United States, their FBI, as well as police from New Zealand and Canada and Australia and other countries where there's financial centers. That network allows for the sharing of information before you go and make formal requests, because money moves very quickly in the global environment, and so they can support the tracking of those finances and building of the evidence before you make formal requests. All right, I'm just mindful of the time. Would we be comfortable to run over a bit, Leon, just to check with you before we proceed?
Yeah, I think we can run over for 5-10 minutes, and if people need to leave, by all means, but if not, be good to get some of the questions. So maybe 5 more minutes, then we'll jump into questions.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. All right. So looking at digital procurement reform, that is central to the bilateral work that we've done in South Africa. So I'm really going to focus on that because that is also what has the strong procurement element to it. We've also initiated what's called the Transforming Procurement Systems program in South Africa. And what that does is it brings together key partners in various policy areas. So we have open ownership who are supporting around beneficial ownership reform in South Africa. So that's understanding who owns the companies beyond directorship level, so looking into shareholder structures, both in South Africa and internationally. We have Open Contracting Partnership, who specialize on open publication and transparency and creation of the open contracting data standards. So really, how do we get more contracting information out into the public domain from government? The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, as mentioned previously, really having that sort of policy focus. And then Government Digital Service, who continue to do their work in sort of the digital transformation and digital reform work. So this is just an example of the areas that they're working in. They're providing advisory assistance, workshops and technical training, best practice sharing and guidance creation, and actually developing open source tools as well that can be used to enhance procurement systems. So looking at some of the key work that has been done primarily through the Global Digital Marketplace program, and that's so delivered by Government Digital Service in the UK. They've worked with various partners in South Africa, the DPSA, the Office of the Government Chief Information Officer, the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer in National Treasury, and the State Information Technology Agency. So I'm just going to give a little anecdotal example in the last 3 minutes that I have of one of the pieces of work that they've done. So in talking to National Treasury and trying to understand what the biggest challenges were, one of the key challenges highlighted by OCPO was there was a need for an ability to respond quickly to parliamentary requests for information. And there was a need to identify conflicts of interest in procurement. So what had happened is we brought in a small team of data visualization specialists, because the understanding was that there's the central supply database and there's a lot of procurement data that OCPO has. But the reality once we got there was that there's this massive system. I mean, central supply database is an incredible system. In fact, interestingly enough, UK colleagues were pointing out that there is no parallel in the UK to the CSD in South Africa. But the system was in desperate need of maintenance. Information wasn't being channeled through it properly. You'd have to go and manually dig out spreadsheets in order to identify certain pieces of information. And another big challenge was the consultancy model, because Treasury had to continuously bring in new consultants to do the work. Every time was effectively a reset. And so it created a lot of disruption and continuity challenges around making sure that a massive system like that is properly maintained and serviced and improved. So we had to pivot our strategy. We then got the specialists that we had to focus on prototyping and using historic data, which was more readily available than the current data. And then they also did an assessment of the functionality of systems and created an improvement report. And based on the data that they were able to access, we developed two very simple dashboards on that data. The first was a spend dashboard, which allowed one to dig into particular provinces, select specific departments, and then understand how much spend was going out. There was also certain policy indicators that you could do there, and supply analysis to see which companies were winning the biggest contracts. Then there was also a conflicts of interest dashboard. And this is very interesting because what we did here was we drew from 3 disparate data sets to create this. We took the data set from the CIPC, which had all the ID numbers of all directors in South Africa for South African registered companies. We cross-referenced that then with the PERSOL system within the DPSA, which has the ID numbers of all government officials. And then we cross-referenced that across the central supply database, which then tracked which contracts were being awarded to which companies. And through that, we could see where a government official held a directorship position in a company which was winning a contract from government. And we actually got 998 hits on that. And interestingly enough, the majority of them were state-owned entities, which then pointed us to this challenge of SOEs, which is actually under the current South African legislative framework, state-owned entities are not prohibited from awarding contracts to their own employees where they're directors of companies, which is a massive hole that's created by virtue of the Public Administration Management Act, Section 8, which applies to all public administration, but doesn't apply to SOEs because, as I mentioned earlier, SOEs are only regulated by your PFMA and MFMA frameworks. So it's a massive hole that this dashboard managed to show us very quickly. So this is just an example of how the dashboard brings up sensitive information. We've blocked out, personal identities, identifiers at this stage because, these investigations haven't even gone live. But the point is that we are managing to pick up these rudimentary points. Status of the project, we continue to work with National Treasury. We've embedded a team of data specialists that are working with OCPO, and OCPO have actually taken up the reins and will be continuing with this work moving forward. Okay. I'll stop there. Questions? I think we're just in time. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sanan. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'll just make sure I'm off mute. Thank you very much. Over to you, Cecilia. I know there's a few people that want to speak and have a few questions.
I think I'd really like to let Steven Powell have a word, particularly just to comment on managing corruption risks from a legal perspective. So, Steven, if you can please share some thoughts and ideas.
Thanks, Cecilia. And just to thank you to Leon and Sanan, it's been really enlightening that just how much is underway, and the level of cooperation and support from the UK to the South African government is phenomenal. So I'm really impressed by that. But what I do want to share is it is so crucial, and you emphasize the importance of due diligence. Due diligence is one of the key cornerstones of an anti-corruption program, and it is also a requirement of the UK Bribery Act. And what has happened in South Africa is the CIPC has issued a guidance note to corporates, which they have to comply with in building their own anti-corruption compliance program. And it seems to be predominantly modeled on the UK guidelines. And so one of the first messages in terms of managing corruption risks is to make sure that your own organization is anti-corruption compliant. The big lament that I get from clients is that, we're anti-corruption compliant. Unfortunately, the guys we're competing with are breaking all the rules and getting involved in tender irregularities and mischief. So I'm going to just walk through the key elements from the guidelines in just less than a minute. The first thing is companies have to have tone from the top. Management must set the right example. The other is you've got to have the policies and the procedures, and due diligence is actually one of those pillars as well. So make sure you partner with the right partners. And in South Africa, a lot of the corruption happens in the name of transformation. So there's a lot of BE partners who partner so that you have the right representation and demographics, but they do no work on your projects. And the various commissions of inquiry have exposed a lot of corruption. I was also quite interested to see the perception of how bad corruption is in South Africa. And I think it's because we've got heightened transparency at the moment. And fortunately, government has actually enhanced the powers of the State Capture Commission to share all the information that they've gathered with the enforcement organizations. And then just to touch on the other two pillars, training is also very important. And one of the messages from me to corporates is train your SMMEs and your business partners. They don't have the sophistication or the resources to go and develop their own anti-corruption programs, but share the basics of what they need to comply with them, and then make sure that you've got processes to continuously monitor corruption. I liked the comment that we had from Terence about the pandemic of corruption we've had in the last decade. And I just wanted to emphasize to all of the delegates attending today that a lot of positive initiatives have happened in SA. The government is currently trying to rebuild capacity in the NPA, and we are starting to see the effects of the Zondo and other commissions where there are now arrests happening, and we're going to see companies being made an example of. And my final point is just kudos to the UK government for setting a role model for South Africa to just lean on when it comes to creating some of the legislation, like the CIPC has done with the guidance note on corporate compliance. And what the UK is also doing with the active enforcement is they are getting companies to wake up and pay attention to anti-corruption compliance, which is helping to build and reinforce ethics in South Africa. That's enough from me for the moment. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much for those contributions and indeed those observations. And just looking at Regina Malloy's reference, the King Code was actually established here by Mervyn King in South Africa. So I think we do have a track record for achieving excellence in governance. We are very quick. I'm an adopted South African. I've been here nearly a decade. We're very keen to criticize ourselves, but as you can see, we're currently 69 in the world. We have high-profile corruption, which doesn't help, particularly around PPE. But equally, there are new mechanisms in place to address this. Any more questions, Cecilia, that have come in on the corruption piece?
No, not so much. I think we've managed to cover everything in Sanan's presentation as well. It is an interesting point that Regina does bring up about the King Code, and it strikes me as this is not unique. Again, we've often developed solutions ourselves, but there seems to be the lack of implementation or follow through, as we also touched on earlier. But I think that the best that we can do as a Chamber of Commerce as well, and as users of these systems, is it's up to us to make sure that we do the right thing and also keep flagging it and making a noise when it's not happening. Because that's as I see it, it's one of the only ways to actually start fast-tracking implementation and adherence to all of these things that are already there and that are built in. And then also, of course, we've got people like Steven Powell, who, if when you do get stuck, you can turn to these people who can help you through the maze of red tape. And sometimes, when the law is simply being flouted.
Thank you, Cecilia. And I'd just like, as we have run slightly over, but I think that's because we've had high levels of engagement and interest, and perhaps we should follow up with another webinar in the not too distant future to deeper dive into this and perhaps address more questions. I think you will see the commitment of the UK government to support South Africa in addressing this, but equally as a chamber, we're here to support our members and be the voice of business, the challenging voice of business, to create a better business environment, because we do believe in capitalism as a force for good, sustainable capitalism. And if we can attract investment, grow our members, grow our businesses, we're going to contribute to kind of growing our societies around us. So we really see ourselves in that role, and members such as Truzo are developing cutting-edge technology apps to enable this. I will remind you that this presentation will be made available in a PDF form for members. If you're not a member, please get in touch and we'll make sure we can address that for you. And we're going to be hosting a procurement and anti-corruption roundtable in March. So we look forward to hopefully seeing you in person when the world returns to the semblance of normality. And I think I'm going to conclude, we have a new president in the White House, and I'm going to quote one of my favorite American politicians, Colin Powell, who's the first African-American Secretary for State. And he says, optimism is a force multiplier. And I think we can all be very pessimistic. Terence referred to a pandemic of corruption. We presently are confronting a pandemic of COVID, but we're not going to sit on our laurels and hide. We need to be out there. We need to be productive, proactive, solutions orientated, and coming together as an ecosystem, the community, to address these problems. And that's really what we're here to do as the British Chamber. Thank you to Sanan, really good insights. We had some really good connectivity. Thank you very much to our members and to our audience for participating. Thank you to Cecilia for hosting the questions, to EMO Emission Control, and Leslie and Venice for ensuring we're all in the right place at the right time on the right platform. I wish you all a much better 2021 and look forward to increased levels of engagement with you all and to coming out of this year better than we ended last year.